Hey, my name is Julia Reynolds, and I'm 27 years old. I live in Evansville, Indiana, where winters feel like a quiet ache that settles into your bones and the sunsets look like broken promises painted in soft orange light. You wouldn't think someone like me could have enemies. I'm not flashy, I'm not loud, and I've always played by the rules. But on Christmas Eve 3 years ago, I learned just how cruel people can be when they think you have nothing left to offer. They said I had no future. They laughed behind my back, smiled to my face, and plotted to break me while singing holiday carols under twinkling lights. And yet, this year, I handed my boss a bonus check for $2,500, and I made sure they all watched me do it. But don't get it twisted. This isn't a story about money. This is a story about humiliation, betrayal, and how revenge, when carefully served cold, can taste sweeter than gingerbread on Christmas morning. Let me take you back to where it all started. At 24, I was working as a junior assistant at Landwell & Parker Financials, a mid-sized corporate firm that looked much fancier from the outside than it was on the inside. I had just graduated in accounting, moved out of my mom's 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of town, and thought I had finally landed on solid ground. For the first time in years, I had stability. I had a cubicle with my name on it, a coffee mug that said, "You got this." I even had a group of coworkers I considered friends, especially Rebecca. Rebecca Collins was everything I wasn't: confident, stylish, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and own it without saying a word. She took me under her wing during my first month and introduced me to everyone at the office. She laughed at my jokes, brought me fancy coffees on Wednesdays, and told me one day we'd rise to the top of the company together. I believed her. That was my first mistake. Before I go deeper into what happened, pause for a second and tell me in the comments, what's your name and where are you watching from? I want to know who you are, because if you're still here listening, you're someone with a strong heart and an open mind. What I'm about to share isn't easy. It's raw. It's personal. But I'm telling it because somewhere out there, someone is being torn down just like I was. And maybe hearing this will remind them they're not alone. Every moment I speak about truly happened. And if you stay until the end, you'll see how I turned a moment of deep humiliation into something powerful, something unshakable. So don't forget to like and subscribe. This story is just beginning. At the firm's Christmas party that year, I wore a deep green dress I bought secondhand. It wasn't designer, but it made me feel elegant. I brought a homemade cheesecake that my mother had helped me prepare, proud of contributing something special. When I walked in, I felt a strange kind of hope, like maybe the life I dreamed of was finally catching up to me. Then came the speeches. Mr. Landwell stood in front of the fireplace in his red velvet blazer, calling out employees for their contributions and promotions. I clapped until my hands were sore, waiting to hear my name. I had closed a massive client account in November, one that had saved the firm over $80,000 in losses. Even Rebecca told me I was a shoo-in for a raise. But when the announcements were over and the clinking of champagne glasses took over the room, my name had never been called. Not once. I laughed it off at first, sipping flat punch and telling myself maybe they had made a mistake. But then I overheard Rebecca whispering to Thomas from HR near the back hallway. "She really thought she had a chance," she said, chuckling. "Poor thing. Julia doesn't get it. This company's not about effort. It's about image. And that girl? She's invisible." I felt like the walls had fallen inward. My knees went weak, and I had to pretend I was checking a message just to avoid crying in front of them. That night, I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. And for the first time in my adult life, I considered quitting not just my job, but everything. But I didn't. I came back on Monday morning with a silent vow. I would become the kind of woman no one could ignore. Not Rebecca. Not Thomas. Not even Mr. Landwell. I didn't know how yet, but I knew that if they thought I had no future, they were going to choke on those words. So I started observing, quietly, ruthlessly. While everyone else gossiped in the break room or spent their lunch hours on social media, I was studying taxes, cryptocurrency, investment structures. I signed up for night courses and skipped every happy hour invitation. I created a secret portfolio for small local businesses that needed financial consulting but couldn't afford the firm's prices. I charged almost nothing. I just wanted to learn. Within 6 months, I had 5 steady clients. By the end of the first year, I had 12. But I still showed up every day at Landwell and Parker, punching the clock like I was nobody. Rebecca stopped inviting me out. Thomas barely spoke to me unless it was necessary, and yet I smiled. Every single day. I built my own empire in the shadows of the very people who tried to bury me. Then came the second Christmas. I showed up to the party again. Same office, same cold air. Only this time, I didn't bring cheesecake. I brought silence. I watched as Rebecca stood in the spotlight once again, clinking her glass and fake laughing at every praise she didn't earn. She was promoted. I wasn't. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. The third year was when everything changed. My consulting business exploded. One of my clients, a family-run construction company, landed a government contract after my restructuring plan saved them from bankruptcy. They gave me a $15,000 bonus. Another small media firm credited me with tripling their profits. Suddenly, I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving, quietly, powerfully. And that's when I made a decision. I took everything I had saved and registered my own financial firm, Reynolds Strategies, LLC. Then I applied for a consulting partnership with none other than Landwell and Parker, under a different business name. They accepted the pitch. They didn't know the woman behind the curtain was the girl they'd mocked 3 years before. When Mr. Landwell saw the return on the strategy within 3 months, he invited me to a strategic appreciation dinner. I accepted. It was Christmas Eve again. I walked into the same conference room they once laughed in. Only this time, I wore a tailored navy suit, red lipstick, and confidence-like armor. I placed an envelope on Mr. Landwell's desk. Inside was a check for $22,500, the bonus I personally earned just from his firm's performance under my plan. "I think this belongs to you," I said with a smile. His eyes widened. He looked at me differently that night. Not like the shy assistant who once begged for approval, but like the woman who held his company's future in her hands. But that's not the part that mattered most. The part that mattered was watching Rebecca freeze across the room when she realized who I was. That the same girl she called invisible had just walked into her world as a boss. Not a colleague, not a rival. A woman above her level, professionally, financially, and morally. They said I had no future, but I didn't just build one. I made sure they could never ignore it again. The Monday after that Christmas Eve, the office was still dressed in its leftover tinsel and pine-scented optimism, but under the sparkle, the cracks in their perfect world had started to show. Rebecca kept glancing at me as if she was trying to place a face from a dream that had suddenly become real. I didn't speak to her. I didn't need to. I simply went to my desk, logged in, and got to work. On my terms. Landwell and Parker had unknowingly become my client, and my strategy had saved them from a potential quarterly disaster. My firm's proposal had streamlined their operational budget and optimized their tax positioning just in time for fiscal close. They were impressed, but they still had no idea who had orchestrated it. That was my power, and I wasn't about to let it go to waste. Over the next few weeks, I received more consulting assignments, this time from other departments. I started having quiet lunches with managers who used to forget my name. They began seeking my insight in meetings, quoting my strategies without knowing they were talking to their former assistant. It was both surreal and satisfying. But I wasn't just there to succeed. I was there to dismantle. Rebecca had just been made head of internal accounts, a position she didn't earn but inherited through charm and office politics. She had no real financial skill, just a knack for manipulation and making people feel small. Her new position meant she had to interact with the strategies I designed, without knowing I was the architect. It was like watching a puppet dance, unaware that the strings were tangled. I started tailoring reports that highlighted inefficiencies, subtle, elegant numbers that pointed toward negligence in her department. Nothing overt, just enough to cast a shadow. I knew which data points to emphasize. I knew how to make numbers speak louder than words. The finance world doesn't deal in gossip, it deals in performance, and I made sure Rebecca's performance started to look sloppy. Meanwhile, Thomas from HR, her favorite ally, began facing his own quiet reckoning. I discovered, through one of my freelance clients, that he had overlooked several harassment complaints in previous years. I didn't leak the information directly. I simply left a carefully placed tip with one of the senior partners who still held integrity like a badge. The kind of man who didn't let things slide when reputations were on the line. 2 weeks later, Thomas was under review. He didn't know how it happened, but he knew someone had dug into his past. He stopped smiling at meetings. He started avoiding eye contact with me. That was fine. I had no interest in his regret, only in his silence. The office that once felt like a cathedral of power and prestige had become a chessboard, and I was now the queen who moved quietly, strategically, with full view of every corner. But I hadn't done this alone. One person had believed in me during my darkest hours. Mrs. Keller. She was a 72-year-old accountant who had worked at the firm since the days when everything was still written by hand. While most people dismissed her as outdated, I saw a woman of wisdom and steel. She was the only one who gave me advice when I was pushed aside, the only one who offered to help me study at night. Bringing printed guides from the library and sticky notes with formulas, she said I must master if I wanted to stay alive in finance. When I started Reynolds Strategies, I hired her part-time. She became my anchor, my sounding board, and my reminder that decency had not vanished from the world. Together, we watched the firm turn slowly toward its own reckoning. Rebecca was losing control. Her decisions started to backfire. A miscalculated quarterly projection, a missed vendor payment, an overestimated tax deduction. None of it was accidental, but all of it was orchestrated to look like her own failure. And in truth, it was, because she had climbed so high on the backs of others that she never learned how to stand on her own. One Friday morning, she called a meeting to clarify confusion in reporting discrepancies. She was flushed, flustered, and visibly nervous. Half the department sat in silent confusion as she blamed interns, systems, and protocols. Not once did she take ownership, and I watched from the corner of the room, unseen and omnipresent. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Mr. Landwell, in his usual composed tone, asked her to step down from managing internal accounts until a full performance audit could be completed. It wasn't a termination, but it was a public rebuke, a step back from power. Her expression faltered, her shoulders dropped. For the first time, she looked exactly like the girl she once made me feel like. Invisible, unwanted, powerless. After the meeting, I passed by her desk. She looked up, and for a second, her eyes locked with mine. Something shifted in her gaze. Recognition, maybe, or fear. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded once and kept walking. But revenge isn't always about the people who hurt you. Sometimes it's about reclaiming the parts of yourself that they tried to erase. My confidence, my voice, my vision. I wasn't just punishing Rebecca or Thomas. I was rebuilding myself from the ashes they left behind. Landwell and Parker, impressed with my continued results, offered to make Reynolds Strategies their permanent consulting partner. The irony wasn't lost on me. They wanted to give a contract to the woman they once didn't promote. This time, I didn't hide behind business names. I signed the deal as Julia Reynolds, CEO. There was a long silence in the boardroom when they read my name. A few confused glances, and then polite applause. But I could feel the tension, the discomfort, the realization. They knew. They remembered the quiet assistant who used to refill coffee, organize files, and stay late without complaint. And now she was the woman they depended on, the one with the answers, the one holding the keys to their future. Back at home, I sat on my worn-out couch, the same one I had when I lived with my mom. I didn't replace it. I didn't need to, because every thread, every faded cushion was a reminder of where I started, and of the war I had silently won. But revenge isn't complete without the final stroke. I wasn't finished. Rebecca had always bragged about her upcoming promotion to vice financial director, a role that would give her power over firm-wide strategy and expansion. It was set for announcement in March, unless someone else was nominated, someone who had already restructured 3 major departments, someone whose firm had increased profit margins by 17% in under a year, someone who had just publicly handed the company $22,500 worth of results, wrapped in a velvet envelope. I had no intention of taking the job, but I submitted my candidacy anyway. Why? Because I wanted her to see my name on the list, to feel it land like thunder, to know without question that her path would never again be obstacle-free, because I wasn't in her shadow anymore. She was in mine. By February, the snow had started to melt, but the cold inside Landwell and Parker was just beginning to set in. Whispers moved through corridors like ghosts. Soft, sharp, and unavoidable. People were asking questions. Why was the Reynolds Strategies consultant attending internal management meetings? Why had Rebecca been so quiet lately? Why was Thomas rarely seen in the break room anymore? Something was shifting in the air, and everyone could feel it, even if they didn't know exactly what it was. The day I submitted my candidacy for Vice Financial Director, I walked into that office like I had every right to be there, because I did. The application wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of power, a signal that I wasn't just here to watch anymore. I was here to conquer. What I hadn't anticipated was how fast the storm would start to spin. 2 days later, Mr. Landwell called a surprise executive meeting. I was invited. Rebecca wasn't. That's when it became real. Inside the glass-walled conference room, surrounded by men in navy suits and women in tightly pulled buns, I presented a 12-month financial forecast that reimagined the company's structure from the ground up. It wasn't a pitch. It was a warning. My final slide said it in bold letters: evolve or collapse. When I finished, the silence was thick. Then someone clapped. Slowly. Then more followed. Mr. Landwell nodded, not smiling, just staring at me like he was seeing something he didn't quite know how to define. I stood still, letting their discomfort settle in. They weren't used to someone like me speaking in absolutes. I wasn't asking for permission. I was showing them the future, with or without them. Outside that room, the building hummed with uncertainty. People stopped making eye contact. Those who once dismissed me now offered hesitant greetings. Even the receptionist, who used to barely acknowledge my presence, complimented my coat. Power, I realized, doesn't just change your circumstances. It changes the temperature around you. Rebecca tried to rally. She cornered Mr. Landwell in the hallway a few days later. I saw them talking from a distance, her hands animated, face flushed. But when he walked away, she stood alone, staring at the carpet like it had betrayed her. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Keller, my mentor, my anchor, collapsed at her desk. I got the call while reviewing reports at my apartment. They said she had fainted, likely stress-induced, and was being taken to Deaconess Hospital. I left everything and rushed there. She was awake when I arrived, her hands cold, but her eyes still fierce. "You're winning, Julia," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But don't lose yourself in the war." It struck me harder than I expected. I had been so focused on victory, on dismantling the system that once chewed me up, that I hadn't stopped to consider the toll it might be taking, not just on me, but on the people who had stood by me. She went home the next morning. I insisted she rest and put her on leave with full pay through Reynolds Strategies, but her words clung to me like morning frost. Was I becoming like them? Calculating? Cold? Consumed? No, I told myself. I was reclaiming justice, restoring balance, right? Still, something inside had shifted. The next week, the internal review team released their findings on Rebecca's department. The numbers were damning. Oversights, missing documentation, inconsistent data entries. It was enough to justify her demotion, and it came with a recommendation that her position be suspended indefinitely pending further investigation. I thought I would feel triumphant, that I'd breathe in her downfall like oxygen, but instead, I just felt hollow. Until I saw the email. It was a forwarded message, anonymous, no subject, just a single line of text. She was never the real threat. Attached was a file, internal chat logs from 3 years ago, names I recognized, messages from Thomas, from another manager named Dan, from 2 senior accountants I had once idolized. They called me a charity case, company baggage, and one raise away from food stamps. They had joked about keeping the pity hire busy. One message read, "Let's just give Julia the numbers nobody else wants. She's too desperate to say no." My heart stopped. All this time I had focused on Rebecca. I thought she had been the architect of my humiliation, but she was just one piece. The machine had been bigger, meaner, older. And it had smiled at me every morning, shook my hand in meetings, offered me cold coffee and fake praise. That's when something snapped. I printed every single message, bound them in a folder, and I delivered them directly to the boardroom at 9 a.m. sharp the following Monday. No warning, no email invite. I just walked in and placed it on the table during their monthly compliance review. "This is what your company culture looks like behind closed doors," I said. "This is the truth you've ignored." They didn't stop me. No one said a word. I turned and walked out before they could. The next morning, 2 senior accountants were placed on leave. A third was quietly let go. Thomas was offered a resignation package before the board could vote on his dismissal. They let him take it to preserve the company's image. As for Dan, the smug manager who once told me I had great potential for admin work, he was demoted, publicly, reassigned to a floor that didn't even face sunlight. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was a reckoning. That same day, I received a formal offer from Mr. Landwell. He wanted me to take over the vice financial director role immediately. No voting, no delay. I said no. He blinked in surprise. "May I ask why?" "Because I built something of my own," I replied, "and I'd rather grow that than repair what you allowed to rot." He didn't argue, just nodded once, slowly. Rebecca left the company a week later. She didn't even say goodbye. She packed her things into a single cardboard box and exited through the side stairwell. I watched her go from my office window. It should have felt like the final scene of a movie, but it wasn't the end. Not yet. Because as I stood there, watching the snow return to Evansville in soft, slow flakes, I realized something. My story hadn't just been about getting back at those who doubted me. It was about making sure no one else would ever have to feel what I felt. Powerless, forgotten, dismissed. And if I wanted to do that, I had one last move to make. The snow had started to settle like a blanket over Evansville again. Softer this time, gentler. There was something poetic about the way winter returned every year. Silent, relentless, erasing what was beneath, but never truly changing the shape of the ground. It reminded me of the company I had left behind. Even with new leadership, new promises, and polished public apologies, the foundation still bore the scars of rot that ran deeper than any press release could fix. I had turned down the vice director position not because I couldn't handle it, but because I no longer needed it to feel worthy. That was the greatest shift of all. Power used to feel like a destination, something I had to arrive at so I could finally breathe. But now I understood it wasn't about titles or desks near the windows. Power was choice. Power was freedom. And with that power, I made my next move. Reynolds' strategies expanded. I hired 2 more consultants, brought in a marketing strategist, and set up a modest office space downtown. Nothing grand, just enough room for growth, sunlight, and the kind of quiet ambition that doesn't scream to be seen. I reached out to smaller firms, family-owned businesses, minority-owned startups, companies that were often overlooked by the big consulting sharks. These were people who reminded me of myself, underestimated, overworked, but full of fire. I gave them what I never had, affordable expertise and someone who actually listened. But not everything was easy. Balancing the new influx of clients with leadership responsibilities tested me in ways I wasn't prepared for. Late nights became the norm. Deadlines piled up. I stopped answering personal texts. I skipped lunches more often than I cared to admit. And even though I had fought so hard to build a life outside of Landwell and Parker, I was slowly slipping into the same patterns that nearly broke me the first time. That's when I got a call from my mother. She didn't ask how my firm was doing. She didn't ask about contracts or clients. She asked if I'd eaten dinner. When I told her no, she said, "Then whatever you're building doesn't matter. If you can't take care of yourself, you're just building another cage." Her words hit harder than any audit or boardroom glare ever could. I hung up and cried for the first time in months. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, alone, exhausted, surrounded by unopened mail and half-filled notebooks, and I started writing a different kind of plan. Not a business strategy, not a 5-year projection, but a life structure. Where would I draw the line? When would I shut the laptop each day? What days would be sacred for myself, for my family, for the things that made me feel human? It wasn't easy at first. Letting go of control felt like failure. I had spent so long equating rest with weakness that giving myself grace felt like betrayal. But slowly, I began to trust that the machine wouldn't fall apart if I stepped back. I delegated more, trusted my team, gave interns actual responsibilities instead of busy work. And in doing so, I realized that real leadership wasn't about doing everything. It was about lifting others to do their best, just like Mrs. Keller had done for me. Speaking of Mrs. Keller, she returned to the office 2 months after her health scare, walking a little slower, smiling a little more. She didn't ask for her old desk back. She asked if she could mentor new hires instead. I said yes without hesitation. Watching her light up while teaching was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. She called it giving back. I called it healing. Then something unexpected happened. One of my former co-workers from Landwell and Parker, Jason, a quiet analyst who always kept his head down, reached out. He said he'd been following my work, admired how I built something from the ashes, and asked if there was room at Reynolds Strategies for someone like him. There was. He became one of my strongest team members. His attention to detail was unmatched, and his humility was refreshing in an industry bloated with ego. And through him, word began to spread. Others left Landwell quietly, one by one, tired of the corporate facade. Not all came to work for me, but many came for advice, for guidance, for something real. At first I didn't see it, but after enough conversations, I understood. Reynolds Strategies wasn't just a company. It was becoming a refuge. A space for second chances, for underestimated talent, for people who had been told they weren't enough, and that made everything worth it. But the moment that sealed everything came during the following Christmas. I hosted a holiday dinner. Not a corporate party, just a dinner. Warm lights, mismatched chairs, potluck dishes, laughter that spilled into every corner. My mother came. So did Mrs. Keller. So did Jason. And the new hires. And 2 of my earliest clients. People shared stories, not resumes. They exchanged recipes instead of LinkedIn links. It was the kind of night that reminded me why I started this in the first place. Toward the end of the evening, I stood to give a toast. I hadn't prepared anything. I just spoke from the heart. I used to think that success meant proving something to people who never believed in me. But what I've learned is this. Real success is about who you bring with you when you rise. It's about the lives you touch, the dignity you restore, and the hope you pass on when someone else is walking where you once crawled. The room went quiet, and then someone raised a glass. Then another, then everyone. I didn't cry, but my voice shook when I said thank you. That night, as I cleaned up plates and folded napkins, I found a handwritten note on the table next to the dessert tray. It read, "You didn't just change your story, you changed ours." There was no signature. I didn't need one. I kept that note in my desk drawer for months. On the hard days, the long days, the days I still felt like the girl with the secondhand dress and silent tears, I read it again and again. Because even when you've built your future with your own 2 hands, the ghosts of the past sometimes come back to knock. And when they do, you need to remember not just who you became, but why. I was no longer the assistant, no longer the invisible one, no longer the joke at the Christmas party. I was Julia Reynolds. I was 27. And I had built a future so loud, so bright, so undeniable, that even silence couldn't contain it. It had been nearly a year since I handed Mr. Landwell that bonus check and watched the cracks in their empire begin to form. 12 months of growth, of rebuilding, of proving that my worth had never been theirs to define. But sometimes, life waits for the moment you finally feel steady to throw a storm you didn't see coming. One crisp November morning, just weeks before Christmas, I received a call that stopped everything. A formal complaint had been filed against me and Reynolds Strategies. The voice on the other end of the line was careful, clipped. "We've been contacted by legal representatives working on behalf of Landwell and Parker," the man said. "They're alleging breach of contract, intellectual property infringement, and conflict of interest during your employment and consultancy periods." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The words fell heavy and sharp. Breach, infringement, conflict. As if I had stolen something. As if my success was fraudulent. as if the empire I'd built from scraps was a crime. But I knew better. I hung up, walked to the window, and stared out at the streets of Evansville, the early signs of snow dusting the sidewalks. My reflection stared back, stronger now, but with old doubts rising in her eyes. I thought of Rebecca, of Thomas, of Dan, of every name in those emails I had delivered to the boardroom, and suddenly, it made sense. This was retaliation, a last attempt by the old guard to strike back, not because I had broken any rule, but because I had refused to play by theirs. I called my attorney, a sharp, relentless woman named Dana, who had helped me set up Reynolds Strategies from the beginning. She reviewed every document, every contract, every signature. Her conclusion was simple and unwavering. "They don't have a case," she said. "This is a scare tactic, an intimidation move to shake you. But Julia, they are not prepared for how calm you've become in chaos." Still, the weeks that followed were brutal. Rumors began circling. A few clients paused their contracts, uncertain whether the allegations would affect their businesses. Some called to ask if it was true. Others didn't call at all. I felt like I was on trial in a court that operated without evidence, without fairness, just whispers and doubts. I lost sleep. I lost weight. I nearly lost my focus. But then something remarkable happened. One of my oldest clients, the construction company that had given me my first bonus, called me directly. The CEO, Manuel, asked if I could meet him in person. I assumed he wanted to cut ties. Instead, when I arrived, he handed me an envelope. Inside was a signed letter of endorsement, stating in clear terms that Reynolds Strategies had helped his company avoid bankruptcy, triple revenue, and remain ethically above board in every transaction. "I don't know what kind of games those people are playing," he said, "but you've been honest with us since day one, and that matters." One by one, other clients followed. The media firm, the bookstore chain, the tech startup I had helped secure angel investors. They sent letters, posted reviews, spoke up. It didn't erase the legal noise, but it drowned it out. I gathered every statement, every contract, every shred of documentation, and sent it to Dana. We compiled a response that was not only a defense, but a counteroffensive. It exposed the attempt for what it truly was: retaliation for whistleblowing, veiled in legal language. Dana filed a response that didn't just deny the claims. It made a statement. I was not afraid. The final blow came when the local business journal caught wind of the story. They had been tracking my rise for months, interested in how a former assistant had created a firm that was now reshaping small business consulting across the region. When news of the complaint surfaced, they reached out. And this time, I didn't hide. I told my story, every word, how I had started, what I had endured, the truth about Landwell and Parker's toxic inner workings, the culture of exclusion and dismissal, the manipulation, the humiliation, and what I had done with that pain. The article went viral locally within days. From secretary to CEO, Julia Reynolds' rise, and the system that tried to silence her. By the time the board at Landwell and Parker met again to discuss their legal position, the damage had already been done. Not to me, but to them. The public saw the truth. The firm's largest client announced they were pulling out, and the complaint against me? Quietly withdrawn. No apology, no retraction, just silence. But I didn't need their apology. I had something better. A few days before Christmas, I received a hand-delivered package at my office. Inside was a card written in looping cursive. It was from Mrs. Keller. It said, "They tried to burn you, and you learned how to light your own fire. That's not revenge, Julia. That's resurrection." I cried when I read it. Not the soft kind of crying, but the deep, body-shaking sobs that come from a place too long silenced. Because I had won. Not just the battle, not just the war, but my life back, my name back, my voice. And then, just days before the year ended, I made one final move. I sent a letter to the board of Landwell and Parker, addressed to Mr. Landwell himself. It was not a threat. It was not a plea. It was a closure. In 2019, you told me I had no future. In 2022, I gave you $2,500 in pure value. Today, I give you nothing but peace. I have no interest in your empire. I'm too busy building my own. Attached was a list of every employee who had since joined Reynolds Strategies. People they once ignored, people now thriving, people who mattered. I ended the letter with one line. You were never my ceiling. You were just my beginning. I sealed it, sent it, and never looked back. Because by then, my firm had grown too wide for walls. My reputation too rooted to be shaken. My purpose too clear to be derailed. The climax of this journey wasn't some grand explosion or courtroom showdown. It was a quiet, undeniable truth settling into place. I had been broken. I had been laughed at. I had been underestimated. And I had become unstoppable. The new year arrived quietly. There were no fireworks outside my apartment window. No loud countdowns. No party hats or champagne flutes. Just the soft hum of the city, the flicker of lights through frost-covered glass, and the quiet stillness that settles into a home built on earned peace. I sat on my couch, that same old couch I never replaced, knees tucked beneath a worn blanket, and allowed myself the rare luxury of stillness. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from anything or toward anything. I just was. I had survived the storms. I had risen above the silence. And more importantly, I had finally laid everything to rest. In the weeks following the article's release and the withdrawal of the complaint, my life began to take on a different rhythm. Clients returned, some apologetically, others without a word. New businesses reached out almost weekly, drawn not just by my record, but by the story that had come to define me. I wasn't just the girl who built something. I was the girl who had something torn from her hands, and who built it again anyway. That matters to people more than they admit. I hired a full-time operations director to take some weight off my shoulders. I increased employee benefits. I began offering mentorships for young women in the local university who wanted to break into finance but didn't have the connections or the courage to believe they belonged. I wasn't just building a company anymore. I was building access. And maybe that's what had been missing all along. Not just justice for myself, but a door left open behind me for the next woman walking with her head down, thinking no one sees her. I wanted her to walk through and never feel alone again. Landwell and Parker continued to shrink from the headlines. More resignations followed. A merger was announced. They never reached out again. No final apology, no handshake or attempt at reconciliation, and I was grateful for that. Some endings don't need closure. Some people don't deserve it. But not everything in my life was about business anymore. My mother had grown quieter in her calls, more curious about who I was outside of work. She asked if I was dating. I wasn't. Not really. I had spent so much of my energy becoming someone I could be proud of that I hadn't made space to let anyone else close. But I promised her I'd try. I didn't say it to appease her. I said it because somewhere inside, I finally believed I had something whole to offer. Even Mrs. Keller began pulling back, slowly transitioning from consultant to advisor, spending more time with her garden and less in the office. She once told me, while drinking coffee from a chipped mug in our break room, I spent 30 years in an industry that never saw me. Then I met you, and I saw what it could be. That line stayed with me, tucked into my memory like a page dog-eared for safekeeping. Because even when everything else fades, profit margins, contracts, buildings, and brands, what people remember is how you made them feel. And Mrs. Keller made me feel like I was enough, long before I ever believed it myself. And I had made her feel seen. In March, I was invited to speak at a local women's leadership summit. I almost said no. I didn't want to be anyone's poster child for resilience. But then I thought about all the times I sat in rooms filled with voices that didn't sound like mine, and how alone I had felt. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one in the second-hand green dress with cheesecake trembling in her hands. So I stood on that stage, under bright lights, and told them everything. Not just the victories, the failures too, the nights I almost gave up, the days I questioned if the fight was even worth it, the moments when power looked like silence, like keeping your head down, like smiling through disrespect. And I told them the truth. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks back into the room that tried to break you, and owns it. When I stepped off the stage, a young woman in the front row reached out and touched my hand. "I work in an office like yours," she whispered. Thank you for showing me I can get out. That moment changed something in me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about reclamation, about reaching back, about using the light I'd fought so hard to create to guide someone else through the dark. The following week, I sat with my team and proposed a new division, one focused on pro bono work for survivors of workplace abuse and discrimination, legal consulting, financial planning, career coaching, every tool they needed to walk away and build new lives. They agreed without hesitation, and just like that, Reynolds Strategies became more than a company again. It became a movement. That Christmas, I didn't go to a party. I hosted a dinner for all the women we'd helped. It was messy and beautiful and filled with stories I'll carry with me forever. Women who had been silenced for years. Women who had lost everything. Women who now stood on their own, taller than before, because someone believed in them. I made a toast that night, same as the year before, but this one was quieter. To the ones who were told they had no future. You were lied to, and you proved them wrong. They raised their glasses, not just to me, but to each other. And in that moment, I realized something I had never said out loud. I was proud of myself, not because of the money, not because of the victory, but because I didn't let them define the ending. They said I had no future, but I didn't just create one. I opened it wide enough to bring others with me. 3 years later, the building where Landwell and Parker once operated was gone. Literally. The structure had been purchased, gutted, and transformed into a co-working space called the Commons, a place filled with plants, sunlight, and endless coffee refills. And on the top floor, in a corner office with windows that opened wide to the city below, was Reynolds Strategies. We didn't take the space for symbolism, though it was poetic. We took it because it had the best view in town, and the rent was low after the scandal left the location tainted in the eyes of investors. I saw it differently. It wasn't tainted. It was reclaimed. From the outside, most people would say I had won. The business was thriving. Our team had grown from 5 to 30. We had partnerships in 4 states and had opened a satellite office in Louisville. We were profitable, sustainable, and most importantly, we were trusted. But victory isn't always measured by square footage or contracts signed. For me, the real win came in quiet moments. Like the Tuesday morning when I arrived early and found Amelia, one of our interns, sitting on the floor beside the marketing desk, head in her hands. She was shaking. I knelt down, no questions asked, and just sat with her. When she finally spoke, she said, "My supervisor at my last job used to scream at me if I was 2 minutes late. I keep expecting someone here to snap." I placed a warm hand on her shoulder and said, "No one here is allowed to break you, and if they try, they don't stay." That wasn't a line. That was policy. Amelia stayed. 2 years later, she became one of our youngest consultants, and she now heads the department she once tiptoed into. Or the Friday we hosted a reunion event for our mentorship graduates. Nearly 150 women came through the doors. Many now entrepreneurs, CFOs, directors of nonprofits, and educators. We served dinner on mismatched tables and gave out personalized notebooks that read, "You are not who they said you were." The room rang with laughter, hugs, and tears. I stood in the back and let the joy unfold without needing to center myself in it. That's how I knew I had changed. I no longer needed to be seen to feel complete. Even Mrs. Keller, now retired and living with her sister in a small home by the river, came back for that night. She wore lavender and still refused to let anyone else brew the coffee. She gave a short speech, just a few minutes long, but every word echoed. "Some people teach numbers," she said, "but Julia taught me that numbers can restore dignity too." She was right. We weren't just helping businesses anymore. We were helping people write new narratives with every budget we restructured, every audit we prepared, every investment plan we guided. I thought a lot about legacy during that time, not because I wanted to be remembered, but because I didn't want the pain I endured to be for nothing. I began working on a book, not a memoir, a blueprint, a guide for women navigating toxic professional spaces, building confidence in silence, finding their footing before they are even handed a title. I called it The Power They Didn't See. It wasn't about revenge. It was about resilience. and it sold more copies than I ever imagined. Not because it was eloquent, but because it was real. There were days I still felt like that invisible girl. Days when imposter syndrome crept in and whispered that I had just been lucky, that maybe none of it was real, that someone might pull it all away. But then I'd walk into a strategy meeting and see a team I built with my own 2 hands, watch as they solved problems with brilliance and compassion, and I'd remember, this wasn't luck. This was earned. I reconnected with my father for the first time in years. He had left when I was 16, disappeared into his own regrets, and never reached out until he saw my name in an article online. He wrote a letter, a real one, in ink. Said he was proud, that he didn't know how to be part of my life back then, that maybe now he could try. I wrote back. We met at a diner off Route 41, the kind with red booths and laminated menus. He was older than I remembered, quieter. He asked questions, listened carefully. At the end, he said, I always thought you'd end up like me. I'm so glad I was wrong. That conversation didn't fix everything, but it opened a door, and doors became a theme in my life. I kept opening them, for others, for myself, for the girl I used to be who thought one rejection meant the end of everything. I built scholarships, I funded therapy programs, I sent anonymous gifts to women I read about in local papers who had gone through similar pain. And I never signed my name, because the reward wasn't the credit. It was knowing they'd feel a little less alone when they opened that envelope. One night, I sat alone in the office, long after everyone else had gone. The city was quiet outside. I turned off my computer, turned off the lights, and walked to the window. Below me, the commons glowed with late-night creativity. Freelancers in hoodies, teams sketching ideas on glass walls, interns sipping coffee from reusable cups. And for the first time, I let myself say the words out loud. I made it. Not in the way they define success. Not in money or titles or power that poisons, but in peace, in purpose, in building something no one could take from me. They said I had no future, but the truth is, I was always the future. They just weren't ready for me yet. And now, I'm not waiting on anyone's permission. I am Julia Reynolds. I was once a girl with no seat at the table. So I built the table. Then I invited everyone they tried to exclude. And we've been building futures ever since. Have you ever been told you had no future, only to rise and prove them all wrong? Share your story in the comments below. If mine touched your heart, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next real journey of resilience, truth, and transformation. Send this video to someone who's been overlooked or doubted. Maybe today is the day they realize their story isn't over. Remember, you don't need anyone's permission to become who you were meant to be. Thank you for listening to my story, and always remember, you are not what they said about you. You are what you choose to become.